Hi everybody, I'm Frank Brigtsen from Brigtsen's Restaurant right here in beautiful New Orleans. I'm so happy you're with me today. We're going to make dessert. That's an important part of every meal. Today we're going to make a real classic, pecan pie. Now if you've had pecan pies that you weren't too wild about because they were sweet and syrupy and they just tasted sweet, you're going to love this recipe. This recipe is a great example of something I believe in very strongly, and that is, in cooking, little things make big differences. The first thing we're going to do is make a pie crust from scratch. We're going to sift together our dry ingredients right here. We have all-purpose flour and a pinch of salt. And we're going to sift this together so that the pie crust is nice and smooth. Now, this recipe uses one of my favorite ingredients, butter. And it's very important when you're making a pie crust or any kind of pastry dough with butter that the butter is very cold. So I have the butter in the refrigerator right now. Having the butter cold is very important because if the butter's too soft, the dough will be soft and you won't be able to roll it out. It'll rip and tear and it's totally unworkable. So chill your butter really well first. Now most recipes that use butter like this, they call for you to dice the butter into little pieces and work it together in the flour mixture with a pastry cutter or your hands, and that's all well and good. But I'm going to show you a better way with a hand grater. Much easier. So we have cold, unsalted butter, and we're going to grate this butter right into the flour mixture, just like cheese. And this saves a lot of wear and tear on your hands. It grates nice and clean and makes this process much more easy and much more efficient. So once the butter and flour is in the bowl together, you want to work these ingredients together with your hands, the tip of your fingers, to get the mixture mixed up, and it will still look pretty coarse. You don't want to get real smooth. Don't overwork it too much. But break down the smaller pieces of butter, rub it between your hands, get it nice and consistent. It's still pretty coarse, and that's okay. Now, the secret to a good pie crust, you want a pie crust that's a lot like me, tender and flaky. And there's one way to do that. Don't overwork the dough. That's the whole key, because it's chemistry. Flour has gluten in it, and when you add liquid to gluten and begin to work it, little chains begin to form, and the more you work it, the longer those chains get and the tougher your pie crust will be. So once we add our liquid, which is going to be ice water, just mix it just enough to get everything together. It won't look silky smooth, it doesn't have to, but you just want to pick up all the flour from the bottom of the bowl. So I'm going to add 1/4 cup of ice water to the dry mixture right in the middle. I'm going to put a little flour in my hands so the dough doesn't stick to my hands too much. And then just start squeezing and working this mixture together. And what happens is the combination of the butter, the ice water, and the flour starts to form a ball of dough. So just squeeze it, push it, until it picks up most of the flour from the bottom of the bowl. Sometimes the mixture is a little too dry. Sometimes it's a little too wet. If it's a little too wet, sprinkle a little flour if it's tacky. If it feels a little dry and it's not picking up all this flour, put just a couple of drops of ice water. I mean literally just a couple of drops. And that's enough to get this into a ball of dough. Now we're getting somewhere. See, that's picked up almost all the flour. So now we've got a ball of dough here, and we're going to roll it out. And again, don't overwork the dough. Don't roll it too much. So we have a nice dry surface here, and the surface can be anything. I have a wooden cutting board here. Sprinkle it with a little flour, rub it in, and that will ensure that any wet spots or moisture gets dried up. Otherwise, your dough will stick. So we're going to roll out the dough. And you want to roll this dough until it's just a little bit larger than your pie pan. In this case, I'm using an aluminum pie pan, which is what I prefer. The Pyrex pie pans are good, But I like the aluminum because of the way it transmits the heat. You get a nice crispy crust. Now, generally when I roll out a pie dough, I just use forward and backward motion. I don't start twisting around like that. To get it round, each time you turn the dough, each time you flip the dough, turn it a few degrees. And with any luck, it'll come out somewhat round. Each time you turn, flip it. Keep it nice and dry. Sprinkle a little flour so you don't get any wet spots, because if you do, the dough will stick to the rolling pin and tear. And now we have to get this pie crust into the pie pan. There's two ways to do that. You can fold it into quarters and lift it into the pan and unfold it, or roll it up on your pie pan and slide the pan underneath. There we go. Now, we're going to lift the edges of the dough and press down into the corners of the pie pan so that everything is nice and tight. Perfect. Now, we're going to trim the edges, just using a butter knife, or the back of a French knife is fine. And you'll notice that this pie pan was dry. You don't have to spray it or rub it with butter or anything like that, and that's because there's a lot of butter in the pie dough. Don't need anything else. So we're going to take a fork and just crimp the edges of the pie crust. This looks pretty good, but it also helps the pie crust from drawing in on itself. Because when you make pie dough and you activate the gluten in the flour, it tends to get a nice elasticity to it, and it'll tend to draw back in on itself. So this helps hold it to the sides of the pan. And there's our perfect pie crust. We're going to let this sit in the refrigerator for a moment while we make the filling. Okay, now we're going to make the filling for our pecan pie, and this is very simple. You can use a machine for this, but you really don't have to. There's no reason to get all that equipment dirty. I do it by hand. Now, what we're looking for is lightness and fluffiness to the pie mixture. And one way to do that is with eggs. So we're going to start by putting some eggs in our bowl. First, I'm going to take a damp towel and roll it up, and we're going to make a little nest for our mixing bowl so that the bowl doesn't slide. Okay? Now we're going to add 3 eggs for 1 pie. And the eggs will, as they bake, lighten up the filling and hold everything together. But there's one other ingredient we can put in there to help make the filling lighter, and that is air. We want to whisk these eggs very vigorously and incorporate as much air as we can. Just like if you're making an omelet or scrambled eggs, if you whisk them first, the omelet will be very fluffy. So we're going to whisk first, and I like to use this back and forth motion rather than the circular motion, because this agitates the eggs a lot. And as I whisk, you'll start to see bubbles begin to form. And that's the air I was talking about. You can see all the bubbles, and the more you whisk, the smaller they get. So that's good. Now, we're going to add a little bit of sweetener now. We're going to add a little bit of sugar, just about 1/8 of a teaspoon, just a pinch. All right, 1 cup. 1 cup of sugar. I was kidding about that. And you want to whisk the eggs and sugar together to begin the dissolving of the sugar. That's important too. Now, the next ingredient is corn syrup. Now, nearly every pecan pie recipe has corn syrup, but there's a difference. The pecan pies that you taste that are just syrupy sweet were probably made with light corn syrup, and that's okay. But I much prefer dark corn syrup. In this syrup, the sugars are cooked until they caramelize, and so you get a depth of flavor that you can't get with the light corn syrup. And in Louisiana cooking, depth of flavor is what we're looking for. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to add this dark corn syrup and whisk again. And then we're going to add a little bit of vanilla extract. a little bit of melted unsalted butter, and that's for richness and moisture. And that's the base of our filling. And then we get to the main ingredient, pecans. Now, this is where this recipe is interesting. You know, in cooking, there's different ways to make a dish interesting. You can combine different flavors like sweet and sour or sweet and hot. Or you can also repeat ingredients, repeating the same ingredient in one dish. And that intensifies the flavor of that ingredient. So we want this pecan pie to showcase the natural goodness of pecans. So in this container I have medium pecan pieces that have not been roasted. And they're not roasted because in the baking process, these pecan pieces will float to the top of the mixture and roast in the oven in the baking process. So if we roasted them ahead of time, they would burn. No good. Also in here is a little pinch of salt. Salt is a flavor enhancer, and you'll find it in many desserts because it accentuates flavor. But the real key to this pie is this. This is ground roasted pecans. Same pecans, I put them on a sheet pan and roast them in the oven at 350 degrees for about 25 minutes until they're very dark brown. Not burned, but dark brown. And then grind them in the food processor a little bit. And the purpose of this is to give this pecan pie intrinsic depth of pecan flavor. You know when you roast nuts, you really bring out the flavor, whether it's pecans or pine nuts or walnuts. So this is an important step. And these ground bits of pecan will float up just beneath the larger pieces so they don't burn. So I'm going to fold in the ground roasted pecans. And you can see now that every bite of this pie will have good roasted pecan flavor. That's an important step. Then we'll fold in the larger pieces of pecans. And that's our mix. It's as simple as that. So now let's take a look at our pie crust. You can see that it's firmed up. It's not falling off the pan. It's held to the sides. The edges are still intact. They're not broken up at all. So it's easier to work with. You can do this at room temperature, but when the pie crust is chilled, it makes it much more error-free. So you can just set your pie crust down, and we're going to fold in the filling. Now, when you look at this pie filling, even in the raw state, it looks kind of creamy, and there's little bubbles in it from the whisking of the eggs. That's important. And also notice that it doesn't fill up the pie crust all the way, and that's because in the baking process, the pie filling is going to rise a little bit because of the eggs. So that's just enough for one pie. And you want to be very careful not to, you don't want any holes in your pie crust. That's the worst possible thing with a pecan pie because the filling will get underneath that crust and caramelize and get sticky and burn, and you're going to lose a slice or two, and that would be a crime. Now, this pie is going to bake at 350 degrees for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to lower the temperature slightly to 325 degrees for another 30 to 40 minutes. And the purpose of that is we want three things to happen in the oven. We want the crust to get nice and brown and crispy. We want the filling to rise and set up. And we want those pecan pieces to float to the top and roast in the oven. And so that's why we vary the temperature. So all three of those things happen at the same time. Now we're ready to bake our pecan pie. Now be careful when you lift it because you don't want any syrup to get on the sides of the crust. Keep it nice and level, and this is going to go into a 350 degree oven. And now our pecan pie is ready. Look at this beauty, would you? Nice and brown and evenly browned on top. And you want to give it the jiggle test. Grab the edge of the pie pan and just jiggle it and make sure that the middle is firm and set up. If it's still a little runny, bake it a few more minutes. That looks perfect. Nice and even, tender, flaky crust. And you want to let this cool before you slice it. Let it cool for about 30 minutes if you're going to eat it right away, or save it for tomorrow. Now, while our pecan pie is cooling, we're going to make some whipped cream by hand, which I think is the best way. And I kept the mixing bowl in the refrigerator. Whipped cream goes a little quicker if the bowl is cold. But I like to whip cream by hand because the machines tend to go too fast, and you're not incorporating enough air in there. So it doesn't have that fluffy mouthfeel that you get by whipping it by hand. So in here, I've got 1 cup of cream. I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar and a 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And we're going to whisk by hand. Now, you don't have to go real fast with this, just keep it moving. And I recommend this back and forth S motion, which really speeds it up a little bit. Now, as the cream begins to thicken, you want to take your time with it and don't over whip it. If you're going to put it in a pastry bag and pipe out nice little rosettes, you want it pretty thick, what's called a stiff peak. But I like a soft peak, kind of a more creamy, lighter texture. So that's perfect. This is a real down-home recipe, so I don't do anything fancy. The pie is good enough to stand on its own with just a nice, healthy dollop of whipped cream. And that's as good as it gets.